Good morning, everyone. Our topic for today is utilitarianism, the consequentialist ethical framework. Act and rule utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is one of the best known and most influential moral theories. Like other forms of consequentialism, its core idea is that whether actions are morally right or wrong depends on their effects. A key point in this article concerns the distinction between individual actions and type of actions. Utilitarianism. Overall view. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism because it rests on the idea that it is the consequences or result of actions, laws, policies, etc. that determine whether they are good or bad, right or wrong. In general, whatever is being evaluated, we ought to choose to one that will produce the best overall results. Letter A. What is good? Under utilitarianism overall view. According to hedonism, the only thing that is good in itself is pleasure or happiness. Hedonists do not deny that many different kinds of things can be good, including food, friends, freedom, and many other things. But hedonists see this as instrumental, goods that are valuable only because they play a causal role in producing pleasure or happiness. B. Whose well-being? Utilitarian reasoning can be used for many different purposes. It can be used both for moral reasoning and for any type of rational decision making. Number one, individual self-interest. When individuals are deciding what to do for themselves alone, they consider only their own utility. Number two, groups. People often need to judge what is best not only for themselves or other individuals, but also what is best for groups such as friends, families, religious groups, one's country, and etc. Number three, everyone affected. While there are circumstances in which the utilitarian analysis focus on the interests of specific individuals or groups, the utilitarian moral theory requires that moral judgment be used on what Peter Singer calls the equal consideration of interest. And letter C, actual consequences or foreseeable consequences. Utilitarians disagree about whether judgment of right and wrong should be based on the actual consequences of actions or their foreseeable consequences. Number 2, how act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism differ. Act utilitarians believe that whenever we are deciding what to do, we should perform the action that will create the greatest net utility. Rule utilitarians adopt a two-part view that stresses the importance of moral rules. According to rule utilitarians, A. A specific action is morally justified if it conforms to a justified moral rule, and B. A moral rule is justified if its inclusion into our moral code would create more utility than other possible rules, or no rule at all. Number 3. Act utilitarianism. Pros and cons. Act utilitarianism is often seen as the most natural interpretation of the utilitarian ideal. A. Arguments for act utilitarianism. Number 1. Why act utilitarianism maximizes utility? If every action that we carry out yields more utility than any other action available to us, then the total utility of all our actions will be the highest possible level of utility that we could bring about. Number 2. Why act utilitarianism is based that traditional, rule-based moralities. Traditional moral codes often consist of set of rules regarding types of actions. The Ten Commandments, for example, focus on types of actions, telling us not to kill, steal, bear false witness, commit adultery, or covet the things that belong to others. Number 3, why act utilitarianism makes moral judgment objectively true. One advantage of act utilitarianism is that it shows how moral questions can have objectively true answers. Often, people believe that morality is subjective and depends only on people's desires or sincere beliefs. Act Utilitarians, however, provides a method for showing which moral beliefs are true and which are false. If we can predict the amount of utility or good results that will be produced by various possible actions, then we can know which ones are right or wrong. Arguments against act utilitarianism. The most common argument against act utilitarianism is that it gives the wrong answers to moral questions. Critics say that it permits various actions that everyone knows are morally wrong. The following cases are among the commonly cited examples: a judge, a doctor, and a person that makes promise. In each case, act utilitarianism implies that a certain act is morally permissible or required. Number 2. The undermining trust objection. Although act utilitarians criticize traditional moral rules for being too rigid, critics charge that utilitarians ignore the fact that this alleged rigidity is the basis for trust between people. If, in cases like the ones described above, judges, doctors, and promise makers are committed to doing whatever maximizes well-being, then no one will be able to trust that judges will act according to the law, that doctors will not use the organs of one patient to benefit others, and that promise makers will keep their promises. Number 3. Partially and the too demanding objection. Critics also attack utilitarianism's commitment to impartiality and the equal consideration of interest. An implication for this commitment is that whenever people want to buy something for themselves or for a friend or family member, they must first determine whether they could create more well-being by donating their money to help unknown strangers who are seriously ill or impoverished. If more good can be done by helping strangers than by purchasing things for oneself or people one personally cares about, then act utilitarianism requires us to use the money to help strangers in need. Why? Because act utilitarianism requires impartiality and the equal consideration of all people's needs and interests. Letter C. Possible responses to criticisms of act utilitarianism. There are two ways in which act utilitarians can defend their view against these criticisms. First, they can argue that critics misinterpret act utilitarianism and mistakenly claim that it is committed to supporting the answers to various moral questions. This reply agrees that the wrong answers are genuinely wrong, but it denies that the wrong answers maximizes utility because they do not maximize utility. These wrong answers would not be supported by act utilitarians and therefore do nothing to weaken their theory. Second, act utilitarians can take a different approach by agreeing with the critics that act utilitarianism supports the views that critics label wrong answers. Act utilitarians may reply that all this shows is that the views supported by act utilitarianism conflict with common sense morality. Unless critics can prove that common sense moral beliefs are correct, the criticisms have no force. Number 4. Rule utilitarianism, pros and cons. Unlike act utilitarians who try to maximize overall utility by applying the utilitarian principle to individual acts, rule utilitarians believe that we can maximize utility only by setting up a moral code that will contain rules. The correct moral rules are those whose inclusion in our moral code will produce better results than other possible rules. Once we determine what these rules are, we can then judge individual actions by seeing if they conform to those rules. Letter A. Arguments for rule utilitarianism. Number 1. Why rule utilitarianism maximizes utility? Rule utilitarianism sounds paradoxical. It says that we can produce more beneficial results by following rules than by always performing individual actions whose results are as beneficial as possible. The rule utilitarian approach to morality can be illustrated by considering the rules of the road. If we are devising a code for drivers, we can adopt either open-ended rules like drive safely or specific rules like stop at red lights, do not travel more than 30 miles per hour in residential areas, do not drive when drunk, and etc. A rule utilitarian can be illustrate this by considering the difference between stop signs and yield signs. Stop signs stop signs forbid drivers to go through an intersection without stopping, even if the driver sees that there are no cars approaching and thus no danger in not stopping. A yield sign permits drivers to go through without stopping unless they judge that approaching cars make it dangerous to drive through the intersection. The key difference between these signs is the amount of discretion that they give to the driver. Number 2. Rule utilitarians avoid the criticisms of act utilitarianism. According to those critics, act utilitarianism A approves of actions that are clearly wrong. Letter B undermines trust among people. And letter C is too demanding because it requires people to make excessive levels of sacrifice. Role utilitarians tend to agree with these criticisms of act utilitarians and try to explain why rule utilitarianism is not open to any of these actions. Number 1. Judges, doctors, and promise makers. Critics of act utilitarianism claim that it allows judges to sentence innocent people to serve punishment when doing so will maximize utility, allows doctor to heal healthy patient if by doing so, they can use the organs of one person to save more lives, and allows people to break promises if that will create slightly more benefits than keeping the promise. Number 2. Maintaining versus undermining trust. Rule utilitarians see the social impact of a rule-based morality as one of the key virtues of theory. The three cases just discussed show why act utilitarianism undermines trust, but rule utilitarianism does not. As a result, people would be less likely to see other people as reliable and trustworthy. Number 3. Impartiality and the problem of over-demandingness. Rule utilitarians believe that their view is also immune to the criticism that act utilitarianism is too demanding. In addition, while the act utilitarian commitment to impartiality undermines the moral relevance of personal relations, rule utilitarianism claims that their view is not open to this criticism. They claim that rule utilitarianism allows for partiality toward ourselves and others with whom we share personal relationships. Letter B. Arguments against rule utilitarianism. Number 1. The rule worship objection. Act utilitarians criticize rule utilitarians for irrationally supporting rule-based actions in cases where more goods could be done by violating the rule than obeying it. They see this as a form of rule worship, an irrational deference to rules that has no utilitarian justification. For example, rules can provide a basis for acting when this is no time to deliberate. In addition, rules can define a default position, a justification for doing a type of action as long as this is no reason for not doing it. Number 2. The collapses into act utilitarianism objection. While the rule worship objection assumes that rule utilitarianism is different from act utilitarianism, Some critics deny that this is the case. According to this criticism, although rule utilitarianism look different from act utilitarianism, a careful examination shows that it collapses into, or as David Lyons claimed, is extensionally equivalent to act utilitarianism. To understand this criticism, it is worth focusing on a distinction between role utilitarianism and other non-utilitarian theories. Consider Kant's claim that lying is always morally wrong, even when lying would save a person's life. For a utilitarian, it is natural to say that the correct rule is do not lie except when lying will generate more good than telling the truth. Number 3. Wrong answers and crude concepts. Although role utilitarians try to avoid the weaknesses attributed to act utilitarianism, critics argue that they cannot avoid these weaknesses because they do not take seriously many of our central moral concepts. As a result, they cannot support the right answers to crucial moral problems. Three prominent concepts in moral thought that critics cite are justice, rights, and desert. For example, of punishing innocent people, the best that rule utilitarians can do is to say that a rule that permits this would lead to worse results overall than a rule that permitted it. This prediction, however, is precarious. While it may be true, it may also be false. And if it is false, then utilitarians must acknowledge that intentionally punishing an innocent person could sometimes be morally justified. Number 5. Conclusion. The debate between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism highlights many important issues about how we should make moral judgments. Act utilitarianism stresses the specific context and the many individual features of the situations that pose moral problems, and it presents a single method for dealing with these individual cases. Rule utilitarianism stresses the recurrent features of human life and the ways in which similar needs and problems arise over and over again. From this perspective, we need rules that deal with types of classes of actions: killing, stealing, lying, cheating, taking care of our friends or family, punishing people for crimes, aiding people in need. Both of these perspectives agree that the main determinant of what is right or wrong is the relationship between what we do or what form our moral code takes and what is the impact of our moral perspective on the level of people's well-being. That's the end of our report. Thank you and God bless.